Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saiduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode on India's climate diplomacy. Climate action is inextricably linked with international cooperation, and India has been an active player in this domain. Navigating this landscape, however, is increasingly complex, with rising geopolitical tensions, the global north-global south divide, proliferation of international forums, and fragmentation within the United Nations. This also makes it important to assess India's opportunities and challenges ahead while reflecting on its past achievements and failures. The Center for Social and Economic Progress recently released a report titled Tracks to Transition: India's Global Climate Strategy. It delves into the strategic debates on furthering climate action efforts and traces India's journey in order to reflect on future prospects. And today we are pleased to have with us the co-editors of this report, Dr. Constantino Xavier, Fellow Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in Delhi, and Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Xavier and Dr. Nachiappan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hi, Saeed. Thank you.
I will pose my first question to you, Dr. Xavier. For a long time, India centered the developing and developed country distinction within its climate-related policies. As India becomes a more active participant, how has this evolved, and how do you assess India's role so far in the global climate discourse?
Thank you, Saeed. I think in a nutshell, the answer is yes. India still differentiates itself from the global north and the developed industrialized countries. So it holds on to that. But at the same time, it has moved beyond just that pillar in its climate diplomacy. Instead of just trying to distinguish its persona as part of the developing, emerging economies world, it is now also looking for partnerships and playing a much more proactive role in, while hanging on to that differentiation, also find solutions to accelerate its own transition and provide solutions to accelerate the climate transition trajectories of other countries that share some of its profiles in terms of being a developing country that also has tremendous growth opportunities and responsibilities towards its populations. But let me quickly dial back, Said, and just tell you also where this report is coming from that we did here with Karthik at CSEP. It comes, in fact, in the context of a larger research stream to understand how India sets foreign policy priorities, how it negotiates abroad, how it looks at international institutions, UN-centric and beyond, and explain on different areas how India is also rethinking its approach to global governance. This happens to be a report focused on climate, but I think much of what Karthik and I sort of share in terms of the framework of this project could equally, partially, and mostly be applied also to issues like trade, health, and any other of the global commons where we're struggling with geopolitical competition, rising powers having different perceptions of global institutions, whether it's the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations, most symbolically enshrined in the membership of the United Nations Security Council. But there's a variety of global regimes that have been questioned by India. And here on climate again, what we found is an India that has moved, therefore, away from just saying we want to be sure that there are common but differentiated responsibilities towards the climate transition, to an India that now is saying let's find actual concrete solutions, whether it's in terms of tech transfer, the allocation of capital, the norms and standards that regulate investments towards greener industrial sectors or manufacturing sectors. All of that shows an India that is therefore a bit more proactive, a bit more exploratory, experimental on the institutions it's comfortable to engage with. And that's, in our report, I think comes out in several ways. India is first an institutional innovator, It works within the COP-centric framework of the UN, but is also comfortable setting up new institutions that are climate-centric. The International Solar Alliance, for example, that is headquartered here in India, initiated by the Indian government in partnership with many other countries from the global north. France, at the beginning in particular, but now has dozens of different members. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which seeks to provide solutions for countries to develop adaptation solutions in terms of the infrastructure that is appropriate to developing countries. It is an India that is brought or is comfortable to bringing climate into the Quad, a minilateral of 4 countries, Japan, the United States, Australia and India, to talk about climate change, about green shipping, about critical minerals, their sourcing and their processing that are required towards developing greener technologies that again can accelerate climate transitions. So on all these you see that innovation of India, that openness towards institutional innovation in different frameworks. And you see it also in India that is much more comfortable in its role as what we heard a lot during the recent G20 presidency that India hosted. The role of India as a bridging power, as a country that mediates between the global north and the global south. And that's not just a symbolic or ideological agenda, it is a very concrete, practical agenda about pitching India as an incubator for energy transitions, for example, that can be rapidly scaled up, can be more financially viable, more sensitive to local contexts, for example, in African countries or Southeast Asian countries or other lower and middle income countries that are rising. So that, I think, shows that in India is much more front-footed, still assessing its exact role or where it can play a role, but it's certainly in India that is very different from 15 years ago, that made, of course, very positive proposals towards the global climate regime, but was less experimental, less engaged, less active on crafting these international institutional frameworks to find solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Xavier, for capturing the several aspects of India's participation in the global climate regime.
Dr. Nachiappan, how would you describe India's diplomatic approach to global institutions, mechanisms, and emerging apparatuses in dealing with climate action?
So I think historically, India has played a critical role in the global climate regime. It was one of the founding members of the UN's framework, the UNFCCC. At negotiations in 1992, if you go back, India had an outsized impact not only on the agreement, but also the politics that was shaping the international rules covering mitigation. So early on, and even thereafter, India pushed for and succeeded in getting a differentiated agreement that mitigation only applied to developed countries because of their historic carbon emissions. So what that meant was developing countries got a pass given historic patterns and could only mitigate if they were provided sufficient technological and financial assistance. That particular tack and norm of equity still sustains, however sparingly. I think in the early years, climate for India was also largely a diplomatic problem and not a domestic problem. So it didn't really have a lot of supporters or takers within government that could do more on climate mitigation. So there was a domestic narrative that emphasized climate equity, historical responsibility, and the primary role of industrialized countries to do more and lead on mitigation. This attention, however, I think has shifted to what countries collectively can do together on both mitigation and increasingly adaptation since then. So if you look at since the 2000s, I think the narrative and discourse has changed more. It's become one where domestic institutions in India began to think more and actually do more on climate. There are two important changes here. The first is the National Action Plan on Climate Change, the NAPCC, and the creation of decision-making bodies in the Prime Minister's office. a Prime Minister's Council on climate change, who could really bring a lot of the agencies to do more collectively on this particular issue. And all these different entities and these new changes began to exert themselves also at climate negotiations from Copenhagen onward in 2008. So the discourse was then, and even now, moving toward what's commonly known as co-benefits, where India would identify and undertake mitigation measures that address climate change, but also at the same time increase economic growth. So it's two. That's why it's called co-benefits. Since then, what we've seen is climate policy, I think, become much more across the government issue. It's proliferated across different agencies and become something that many ministries can tackle. Since 2014, in particular, this narrative, I think, still remains one of co-benefits, but one where India not just does what it can domestically, but also increasingly does more internationally because of its size, its visibility, and the expectations that are increasingly placed on India, given its economic growth, that it needs to be part of the solution and not just the problem. And that particular aspect, I think, testifies not just to what India does at annual COPs, but also what it does through its NDCs, its nationally determined contributions, its net zero pledges, and other areas like, for example, its electric vehicles policy. So climate has also, I think, become an issue that's engaged and undertaken across different agencies through various policies. If I would sum up India's climate diplomacy today now, I think it's characterized by maintaining what I call an equity plus domestic efforts tack at COPs, keeping the pressure on developed countries to do more on mitigation and adaptation, and importantly, designing and following through on commensurate pledges on carbon emissions and other aspects like renewable energies, where India is a leader, that lets others recognize that look, India is a focused and concerted climate actor, and it's willing to do more, not just domestically, but internationally out of interest.
Thank you, Dr. Nachiappan, for that answer. I'll follow up that answer by drawing focus on two sectors. So technology and finance are critical for low carbon growth in developing countries. How does India cooperate with others here?
So these are important issues, and I think India's upcoming international climate engagements will possibly focus heavily on these issues going forward. And this is also something that I hope Tino and I can do more work on. A key assumption of the report that just came out is that, look, climate diplomacy is fragmenting and it's being discussed across multiple sites. So there's a proliferation that's going on. And that's also true of climate finance. We increasingly see this issue being discussed and negotiated at various levels. So not just COPs, but also multilateral development banks, private frameworks, and bilateral partnerships, green partnerships, where countries will work with the public and private sector to generate and deploy more climate finance. And that's also largely because we are in a world that's awash in private, not public capital. So mobilizing international finance will be at the core of the challenge of climate change going forward. There exists a huge gap in the required capital for global mitigation and adaptation needs that need to facilitate the ongoing climate transition. So we need to think very seriously and rather openly about this challenge. And I think the sad truth is that there is global capital, but that global capital is risk averse. It's not expanding, or it's not going to developing countries where the needs are. So even though you see opportunities and gaps in developing countries when it comes to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, I think these are not being filled for various reasons. So the Indian government will have to become more agile. It will have to become more proactive in working with and leveraging global capital. That includes both making a whole array of domestic reforms, changing your institutional ecosystem domestically to welcome more climate finance, but also we'll also work with different kinds of actors, networks, and coalitions to generate and bring that capital back home to India. So there's also a clear need to reform multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, the ADB, and work with them actively. One opportunity here that's just in the news is with the Loss and Damage Fund, which, as it has been decided, will be managed by the World Bank. So there's a clear opportunity there for India to take a leading role. Besides MDBs, I think there's also a need to leverage private sector-led climate mechanisms and networks that manage vast pools of investor capital, which includes sovereign wealth funds, government pension funds, and other kinds of institutional investors. And so there's a large ecosystem here that I think the Indian government has to be aware of and engage openly going forward. And as I mentioned, I think investing in climate adaptation is difficult for private capital. And as a result, this has to be a government-led and government-supported endeavor. There is no substitute here for that. Also equally important here are the partnerships that India will have to cobble together with countries like the US and with partners like the EU. I think where there's enough momentum now to develop institutional mechanisms that incentivize both finance and technology partnerships to deal with the problem of climate change. So there is a lot here that can be done, both domestically and internationally. And I suspect this will increasingly be an area that India will have no choice but to play a much more leading role in, given its own mitigation and adaptation needs.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Nachiappan. Moving to policy in India, Dr. Xavier, when envisioning the future of India's climate diplomacy, what are some course corrections that you will want to see, and what steps does the government need to take to enable these?
So our project gives some, not all answers to your question, Saeed. I think we commissioned these several pieces, 7 or 8 different case studies, looking at India's various engagements that Karthik mentioned across different levels. I think I'll start with really one of the main findings, which may be intuitive, but is important for people looking at this from the outside into India, is that in its rush and openness to develop new, what we call tracks for transition and the new platforms of cooperation beyond the UN framework, this is maybe the right time for a reassessment of what institutions are actually catering possibilities for India to transform its climate commitments into action. We see this across all 4 levels that we analyze, the first one being the multilateral track. It's important not to forget that while the UN system may be losing some of its capacity to coordinate and to engineer climate action, it still remains the fundamental pillar, the multilateral track. And India is still playing an important role in that. In fact, one of our case studies shows that India's been doing more than its commitments in terms of reporting and also developing systems of reporting its progress. The second track, we call the minilateral track, where India's been innovating, creating new institutions such as the International Solar Alliance and the CDRI, which I mentioned before. Here again, it may be worth thinking what these institutions really bring to the table. So what is the utility of talking climate within the Quad? It's not that there is none, but again, calibrating and being clear of what India can do at what levels is important. Same, for example, in the case study that we have on the European Union, where India signed a climate partnership with in 2016, but at the same time also signed a variety of bilateral partnerships with EU member states that often are in dissonance or overlap with the EU-wide framework. Within the EU, for example, now we have a new coordination platform called the European Union India Trade and Technology Council, of which 2 out of 4 areas are focus on climate, including on green technologies, energy transition. So again, this tells you that India has been signing several of these instruments, creating some of them. But first of all, maybe not a course correction, but a step back to think how India can reach the 2030 targets and the 2070 net zero target is an important exercise. Second, as I think Kartik was also mentioning, the international is becoming enmeshed with the national and vice versa. You want to have to develop more institutional channels to communicate between both levels. This means that you can, of course, set targets abroad and then import them at home. You can set targets at home, which happens less in the Indian case, and then take them abroad. But as Kartik mentioned, that is also happening now more. We didn't see this 10 years ago, but it's happening now. But key to this is institutional and state capacity. This means that you need to develop interministerial coordination. You need to develop new institutions and bodies that track India's progress, that represent India's interests abroad, and in a context where many of these international institutions are coming under geopolitical pressures. These negotiations, it's not that they've never been so, but they're becoming more than ever deeply political, deeply competitive abroad. So that means you have to be prepared to build coalitions among developing countries, among geographic clusters, sectoral clusters, champion their interests, not just in voice and articulation, but also in terms of negotiation power at multilateral, minilateral, all these different settings. And for this, India needs much more capacity. Strangely, we found out that the Ministry of External Affairs, which represents India's interests abroad, used to be in the lead on a lot of these climate issues 15 years ago, between 2007 onwards. Today, we don't have any dedicated climate unit or division within the Ministry of External Affairs in India. So we went from one extreme to the other. This is one of the recommendations we make, that while diplomacy is only one part of all this, it needs to be backed up by resources and technical capacity in the Ministry of External Affairs. Also, in terms of apex institutions that negotiate between the internal and the external, India used to have a special envoy for climate change. You will know the Chinese have one. In fact, they've had the same one now for almost 10 years. The Americans have one. Different countries have these different special envoys that articulate policy abroad and also transmit developments abroad internally and play that two-level game. And that is another recommendation we make, that India should maybe reinstitute some type of special envoy that responds to the Prime Minister, which India used to have between 2007 and 2010. Another possibility that we talk about to build up on what also Kartik mentioned in terms of engaging more with the private sector, with the multilateral development banks. But a third one, if I may add, is on the importance of the Global South and how India can scale up energy transition solutions in India and not export, but co-develop them with other low and middle income countries to accelerate their decarbonization trajectories. So that's something India is already doing, but we'll need to do much more of, especially in a context where we see a China that is much less wedded to the Global South concept. It will remain an important actor, for example, in Africa. But the years 2014, 19, those 5 years where China deployed massive capital to these countries to also include them with the energy transition are slowing down. And at the same time, we see also the US, the European Union, much less able, willing, capable to deploy finance and tech to the Global South. And that's exactly what makes India so interesting as an intermediary site for these countries to scale up technologies and then develop them in partnership with the Global South. So that's also a research agenda we're pursuing, and something we're recommending in government needs to accelerate, what we call triangular climate partnerships. These triangular partnerships have existed for a long time. but they've not been climate centric. They've been strong on health, sometimes on tech, on governance issues, but less on climate. So that's something that India seems to be keen to do more of, but will need, again, the resources, the partnerships with the global north countries to be able to deliver to the global south.
Thank you for sharing those insights from the report with us. I'm now moving into the final question, and I would like to give you both the opportunity to answer this. So COP28 is now less than a month away, and the world is more divided, given the ongoing conflicts and the US-China competition. What kind of impact would these events have on the outcome of COP28? And more broadly, how does climate diplomacy work in the times of global competition? Karthik, would you like to take it first?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's a difficult question, right? I mean, will these tensions affect how countries position themselves at COPs? I think yes, perhaps to a certain extent. But I think it's also important to remember that this intense geopolitical competition also doesn't neatly map on to international climate politics, especially COPs and FCCC meetings, because of how they have been structured for years. And they've been structured in a way there's a clear difference or firewall between developed and developing countries, right? So US-China tensions, for example, may not, push countries to sign on to commitments because of how the United States or China is approaching that particular issue. I think it's important to remember that COPs are really unique institutional creatures. And the discussions at COPs are defined and largely shaped by how willing countries are to doing more on mitigation. So if you're developing countries, then the logic is similar, right? And this recurs every year, is to negotiate enough space to burn carbon without compromising your development pathways, while at the same time working the regime and the negotiations to get enough support for both mitigation and adaptation. Like other countries, India will be compelled to balance these two pressures. Last year, if you remember, India did not sign on to the pledge to phase out fossil fuels, but it worked with other developing countries and China to phase down. So for various reasons, structural, institutional, India and China, I think they work together at different climate negotiations. They're clubbed together at COPs as big major emitters that need to do more to reduce emissions. They are increasingly targets and are asked to do more when it comes to pledges, and both often resist such pressures. So you might expect that to continue at this particular COP as well this year. Where you are seeing this competition play out is outside COPs, and that's reflected in our report. In different fora across different levels where countries are able to use climate to advance their strategic and domestic interests, they will do so. So, for example, on renewable energies, the leadership that India has shown is shaped and influenced by its massive domestic solar industry and its capabilities there. If you look at the Quad, where 4 strategic partners are working on climate change, it's on adaptation, it's on climate resilience, it's on biodiversity, climate technologies, because they share interests there, larger strategic interests to do more together. And that's also because these are not anything to do with pledges, right? There are opportunities given convergent interests on this particular issue and others. And that's the same thing if you look at the US-India or the EU-India climate partnerships that are developing now, which are, again, driven by practical considerations, objectives, and strategic convergence, and not necessarily targets per se. And my sense is that these forms of climate cooperation have risen. They will continue to proliferate because countries see these as opportunities to do more on climate and advance their mutual interests, which makes it a win-win. And I think this trend will likely continue and intensify because that larger strategic competition between the United States and China will not go away. and neither will the climate crisis, which will generate more opportunities for like-minded countries to do more on this particular issue.
Dr. Xavier, if you would like to add to that.
Yeah, not much more to add, except my expectation would be, based on what we learned from this project, is that we'll see in Dubai an increasing clash of paradigms. I think you'll see from the industrialized countries a growing sense of urgency, but decreasing resources and capabilities to actually transform that urgency into action. That begins with its own financial commitments, on which it has failed systematically and annually the last few years. And I don't see any hope in sight for that to change, given the economic conditions in the US and the European Union, electoral cycles, etc. But politically, of course, the appetite and the urgency is still there. And it's also politically an urgency that is not only driven by governments in separation from the rest. This is also a deeply held commitment and shared concern by civil societies in the United States, Canada, and the European Union, and other industrialized countries. So that is one side of the clash. The other one, as we, I think, illustrated over the last few minutes, is an opportunistic, if you want to call it tactical approach, saying that we will grow, and the climate transition is almost a positive externality of that growth. We will add climate to our growth-centric model because we have to keep lifting people out of poverty. India lifted around 415 million people out of poverty in the last 10 years alone. These are the frontmost center priorities for any leadership, not only in India, but across the developing countries, including in Southeast Asia, for example, among many ASEAN countries. In China still, though China is ahead of the curve. So the mindset challenge, the mindset on this side is, of course, we will grow and we will even ramp up coal if needed, and we'll keep doing it, even as we develop alternatives to accelerate and deliver more on climate action. My sense is we'll see much more of this clash happening very soon and over the next months to come. Second, I expect India to take the Global South to COP more than ever. It has done so, of course, in the past. But post G20 summit in September in Delhi, this Global South-centric approach, developmental approach, of which climate is only one angle. We could be talking about technology, digital public infrastructure. We could be talking about health and tech appliances to the health modernization of developing countries, health sector modernization of developing countries. But the developmental approach of the Global South will be ramped up by the Indian government. This is not only, as many, I think, mistakenly have identified, a political gimmick or a symbolic gimmick. This is about initiatives such as the one that India announced, which is the LIFE initiative, which is an all of society transition approach. This cannot be just an economic approach, a transactional approach. This needs to be a broader developmental macro change to the way societies are organized and the way societies deal, are embedded with their respective environment, and also with, of course, global responsibility. So I expect much more of that to happen. Unlike in the past, though, this is a question we've gotten often over the last few weeks, is this will not necessarily, in my view, lead to a revival of the basic countries. And at the basic countries' heart was, of course, the India-China cooperative dynamic to develop a negotiation bloc within the UN and beyond the UN. That is unlikely for the reasons Kartik mentioned, that India and China currently are simply not on talking terms, even on climate, which would be a low-hanging fruit. And second, also because of the reason that China is just, even in the Global South, not seen anymore as a Global South country. It has different interests. It has reached now a different economic development stage, and therefore it has also a much less committed approach to the UN, which it used to have, and to other institutions that were active in the Global South. So I think if you look at these 2 or 3 expectations, maybe I'm sounding a bit pessimistic, but I want to underline what Kartik was saying before. about the mitigation agenda being seen here in India as a growth opportunity in the agenda, despite some skepticism. So the trick is to find ways to explain, to find ways for India to open up its markets to investments that come, of course, with expectations about or the so-called green capital, with certain checkbox that have to be ticked. But at the same time, understand that will have to be negotiated politically, and will have to be negotiated specifically for India.
Dr. Xavier and Dr. Nachiappan, thank you for joining us today and for this engaging conversation. You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.